The reason why climate change is such a headfuck is because it's universal, it's affecting everything, it's existential, which means everything's going to go extinct, and it's exponential, which means it's getting worse and worse.
Inconceivable! You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Global greenhouse gas emissions are still rising. The data suggests the planet is warming at an alarming rate. What to do about it? Well, my guest today is Roger Hallam, co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, a movement dedicated to mass resistance and civil disobedience. How far are the climate rebels prepared to go?
Roger Hallam, co-founder of Extinction Rebellion and prominent spokesman as of June 2020. He also features in videos posted in July on the XR YouTube channel. In June, he set up a new political party named after an XR tagline, Beyond Politics, and whose other slogans of Tell the Truth and Act Now also repeat Extinction Rebellion's core message. An early action of Beyond Politics was to attack NGOs for not doing enough by throwing paint on their offices, and this action was accompanied with a long and rambling statement with a dose of religious language. The main target was Greenpeace, accused of taking money and doing little, and it should be noted that Greenpeace has recently been fined £80,000 for disrupting a North Sea oil rig by boarding it earlier this year, and in 2013 confronted Putin's oil industry in the Arctic Circle, which is a lot more daring than throwing paint at an office. Extinction Rebellion UK has since issued a statement which goes some way in distancing the two organisations and Roger Hallam's role in XR. However, his latest video from XR appears to be promoting his new political party and to push XR into being more radical. I will review Roger's arguments and draw attention to his terrible understanding of the science. It is inconceivable that a prominent campaigner on climate action has such a poor and dangerous understanding of climate science, and it needs to be cooled down. Either Roger Hallam is ignorant, or he is deliberately misrepresenting the science for political reasons, and I'll go on to explore his new politics and why it's a threat. The links are in the description, so you can review the video yourself and make sure I'm not misinterpreting his words.
The reason why climate change is such a headfuck is because it's universal, it's affecting everything, it's existential, which means everything's going to go extinct, and it's exponential, which means it's getting worse and worse.
So yes, climate change is everywhere. It is global warming, and that's an important point. It is global, and I'll come back to this. Existential? No, it doesn't mean that. Although climate change is an existential threat to civilization, our civilization, and neither is it exponential. CO2 has risen steadily, as has temperature. It has not doubled and then doubled again, which exponential means.
So one of the things I'm going to be banging on about, and hopefully you're all going to get your head around this, is what's called nonlinear dynamics or herding. And I'll describe this in a lot more detail. And it sounds really intellectual, but it's actually not that complicated once you get your head into it. And everything, all the work I do is about nonlinear dynamics. Well, basically what nonlinear dynamics mean is one day you're walking along the road and then suddenly you fall in a hole. It's like everything's fine and then everything's off the cliff bad, right? And in systems, whether natural systems or social systems, often that's not the case, right? Things just trundle along. But in particular circumstances, you have these situations where you're just trundling along and then it goes and everything falls apart. And we need to understand how that happens and why it happens, okay? And herding is one element of it. Herding basically means if everyone's doing X, everyone else does it. And this is related to us being mammals, and there's lots of research on it. So if everyone's being nice, as it were, everyone else is being nice.
Here, Roger conflates two very different things. The climate as a non-linear system, and in his example, human behaviour when it comes to threat. Humans are not herd animals because herds, or shoals of fish for that matter, are using herding as a response to evade predators. And those predators can also include mammals. And I'm personally not keen on such terminology, because describing people as sheep or sheeple is frequently done by conspiracy theorists to imply the rest of society is stupid and only they can see the truth. In climate science, a non-linear system is a system in which the change of the output is not proportional to the change of the input. The chemist Arrhenius, a century ago, studied the effects of carbolic acid, CO2, on the atmosphere, and purely looking at the physical properties and only including the increase in water vapour, estimated a tripling of atmospheric CO2 would increase temperatures at the poles by 8 degrees C, but he was unaware of the feedbacks and the complexities of climate, which is why there's such a wide range of temperatures for a doubling of CO2 in today's science of between 1.5 centigrade and 4.5.
So I'm not going to go on about loads of stats, but we're familiar with this stat at the moment, which is 5 degrees centigrade by mid-century. 5 degrees centigrade is it's locked in. You know, it's not necessarily going to be mid-century, but quite possibly because of other things. But let's not worry about that. It's going to be 5 degrees centigrade, you know, and that's 10 degrees inland. That's 30 degrees on a hot day, right?
Magellan, oh dear! Oh, what am I on?
Magellan is the howler, I'm afraid.
This statement is wrong on almost every level. The IPCC assigned representative concentration pathways, RCPs. They include a worst-case scenario and other pathways including rapid decarbonisation and negative emissions, as well as slowing emissions at some future point. The business as usual scenario, RCP 8.5, is where CO2 emissions continue at their current rates, and over 80 years would lead to CO2 3 times greater than it is now, although humanity will certainly be in decline before the end of the century, and most fossil fuels will be completely depleted, making it highly unlikely as humanity will struggle to find stuff to burn. RCP 6 appears to be the basis of Roger's statement, where emissions cause a doubling of CO2 compared to pre-industrial levels, sometime between 2050 and 2080. And this also ties into the bell curve graphs he later refers to. Doubling of CO2 and the studies that seek to understand the global temperature increases are a scientific benchmark. There is nothing special about 560 parts per million. It is simply twice the pre-industrial level of CO2. If we took the current global reserves of fossil fuels, for instance, and they amount to about 3,000 gigatons of carbon, that would increase CO2 levels to 700 parts per million, which is about 2.5 times higher than pre-industrial levels.
It'll be 5 degrees centigrade, you know, and that's 10 degrees inland, that's 30 degrees on a hot day, right?
The 5-degree warming baked in for 2050 is nonsense, and the 10 degrees inland and 30 degrees whatever is entirely meaningless. The science estimates that business as usual emissions, a doubling of CO2 would result in global warming of around 2 degrees Celsius sometime after 2050, which is a transient climate response to TCR, with an equilibrium sensitivity. That is when the climate system settles down over a period of decades of up to 4 degrees C. Now that's on the high end. A 2-degree warming will be a challenge to our civilization. 3 degrees will make it extremely difficult, and 4 degrees is a nightmare. There is no need to exaggerate or misrepresent the science. Cherry-picking the worst outcomes is as foolish as the climate change deniers cherry-picking the best outcomes. Stick to the science. Tell the truth.
And so most people think, okay, so, you know, that sounds quite bad. But what they don't realise is that the Earth's geophysical system is like highly non-linear, right? What happens is, if you look in the long historical record, it flips from 2 steady states, which is around 23 degrees centigrade. And that's when there's no ice on the ice caps. And it's, you know, 20 degrees, 40 degrees in the Arctic. And there's tropical forests and alligators that used to be at the North Pole. And then it flips down to loads of ice, which is, you know, Ice Age. So you have a look. So what you tend to find is once the ice starts melting, it flips up really quickly to a new, because once all the ice is gone, then you're at a steady state. Do you see what I mean? Because the Earth has heated up. So the Earth mainly heats up because the ice is gone. I mean, this is simplistic, obviously. And then it returns. So you can see here that you can see this non-linear dynamic thing, which is you trigger something, then it's like knocking a ball down a hill. So you might say, oh, I've only knocked the ball, you know, 5 meters away. But if you don't have the theoretical understanding that the hill suddenly goes like that, you can think, well, that's all right, it's only 5 meters away, I can catch it up, if you see what I mean. But it's actually like out of reach. And once it's out of reach, then you go up to 23 degrees centigrade, and that's goodbye human race and all that stuff.
Roger is beyond wrong on almost every level. For the last 2.5 billion years, Earth's climate has fluctuated between ice house and greenhouse conditions. Over this period, 5 great ice ages have occurred, with durations ranging from 30 to 215 million years. For the rest of this period, more than 70% of its history, Earth appears to have been in a greenhouse state, largely ice-free, even at the poles. The last time the Arctic was ice-free was 2.5 million years ago in the Pliocene. That lasted about 3 million years and saw a period when CO2 was similar to that of today, with temperatures globally being about 2 to 3 degrees warmer and sea level about 25 meters higher. And it was a time when woolly camels lived in the Arctic Circle. The South Pole was growing ice about 30 million years earlier. For the last 2.5 million years, the Earth has been in the Quaternary glaciation, also known as the Pleistocene glaciation. It's an alternating series of glacial and interglacial periods, and we're still in that ice age. Where Roger may be confused with his idea of two steady states is the cycle of glaciation and interglaciation, and this is triggered by orbital forcing. The Earth's axis wobble and the distance from the Sun, also known as the Milankovitch cycles. The next glaciation would have occurred on schedule with a combination of rock weathering that would remove CO2 as well as abundant forests. But humans turned up and we discovered agriculture about 5,000 years ago and changed that cycle as we cleared the forests and now pump out CO2. I don't have a clue where he gets his temperature range of 23 degrees Celsius as the hothouse and 13 degrees Celsius as the glaciation period. The pre-industrial average global temperature in the interglacial period is 13 degrees.
This is another non-linear dynamic, right? Which is the human body can only survive within a certain temperature range, right? So, as people might know, there's this thing called the wet bulb effect, which is 35 degrees centigrade, 100% humidity or something along those lines, and basically the body dies in 6 hours because it can't cool itself down. So there's an absolute upper limit to how much the human body can live. At a certain point, so this is the population, other things being equal, and at a certain point, which is this wet bulb effect, the whole population dies. So it's not like, hey, we've got some heat, we've got some heat, we've got some heat, it's a little bit of a problem, it's a little bit of a problem, it's more of a problem. It's like, bang, you know, you've got 3 million people in Karachi died in a weekend. And this is already happening in the animal kingdom, as you may know. You know, like certain, you know, 200,000 deer or whatever on the Russian steppe, it gets to a certain temperature, the physicality of it basically means they all die.
On these points, Roger gets some of it wrong and some of it right, but interprets it wrongly. Wet bulb temperature is a means to mimic human response to temperature and humidity by wrapping the thermometer in a wet cloth. Above a range of temperature and corresponding humidity, humans die of heat stroke. And climate change will see an increase in high heat and humidity in the tropics, which will be fatal if people don't have access to air conditioning. As to thousands of animals dying because of this, I failed to find any source, although some animals are particularly susceptible to heat stroke and dehydration, as all dog owners should be aware of. It is his next point that is bad science.
So where is that point? So arguably, you know, well not arguably, but almost definitely it's at 5 degrees, because at 5 degrees it's 10 degrees inland. But you only need like a few days of it being 50 degrees and you hit this, right? Because the following day, the following day, the temperature can go back down again, right? So you only, you know, for the sake of argument, you only need like 2 weeks of the year for it to be 50 degrees centigrade to kill, say, 25% of your population. You see what I mean? So once it gets to here, basically that's the extinction point because you're terminally in decline. So let's say 25% of your population dies every 5 years. And, you know, maybe people are born, so it goes up by 15%, but it means it keeps going down and down until it gets to zero.
First, we are not going to see that 5 degrees warming and the 10 degrees inland and the 50 degrees now, whatever. And with catastrophic warming, that is not going to be evenly spread across the planet. Polar amplification will see greater warming in the Arctic, and increased periods of fatal high humidity and temperature will be restricted to the tropics. That's not to say that those living in temperate zones will not be subject to more frequent heat waves. They will, and deaths will result. And with catastrophic increases in temperature, the global south will not idly wait to die. They will migrate to cooler climates. The threats and challenges of even a 2-degree warming are great enough without the need for exaggeration, and certainly not the misrepresentation of the science.
So here's the probability curve, right? So we could be at 5, we could be at 3 degrees here, we could be at 1, we could be at 5, right? So if we're, X basically means some crap's happening, and Y means some other crap's happening, right? So you have to add them up to find how bad things are. So this is like a probability thing. But there's a 0 possibility of hitting extinction, right? In this scenario. So this used to be the old idea, which was we were going to head to 2 degrees centigrade. It was going to be pretty bad. This is the global north and this is the global south. And you add them together and that's how bad it's going to be. Now, metaphysically, right, there's something totally different with this scenario. In this scenario, like this is the 5 degrees scenario, let's say for sake of argument, there's this terrible thing happening, there's this terrible thing happening, but there's also a 10% likelihood of extinction. So if there's a 10% likelihood of extinction, then it's sort of like X plus Y plus a percentage of extinction.
Roger's rather long summing up of his understanding of the science, which is mainly wrong, is that extinction is a possibility with his 5-degree scenario. The reality is that civilization will most likely go into terminal decline with 3 degrees of warming, beyond the point some great technological fix could be instigated to save mankind. His need to jump to 5 degrees warming as a near-term event appears to be political, to make this zombie apocalypse that we have, which is moving very slowly, to one that is very imminent. If humanity is so foolish not to decrease CO2 emissions by 2050 and carry on as business as usual, then sometime in 2060 or so, there would be a further 1 degree rise in temperature. And that's at the high end. By the end of the century, we could see up to 4 degrees global temperature increase above pre-industrial levels. It is a massive threat, and there is no need to exaggerate. But the rest of his talk needs this immediate extinction level threat to reach and justify his political endgame.
The fatal flaw is herding, right? So what happens is in XR is here's all the original members going, we're fucked. And, we've got to do something. So all these people move into XR. And they're loads more radical than society because they know that climate change is happening. But they don't go to what I call this truth line here.
Roger's truth line is built on misrepresenting science. His truth is that radical action needs to happen to avert mass deaths and 5 degrees warming in 30 or 40 years. Extinction Rebellion globally has in a short period put climate change on the agenda, with even the British Tory government announcing plans to ban internal combustion engines by 2035 and to decarbonise by 2050, which is the deadline agreed in the International Paris Agreement. Of course, Britain and other developed nations must be far more ambitious and are advanced enough not to leave it to the last moment and achieve those targets a decade or more earlier.
The truth is that if we don't slash carbon emissions in the next 5 years, we're going extinct.
Science doesn't deal in truths. They are left to politics and religion. It deals with evidence and presents facts, such as a doubling of CO2 will cause between 2 and 4 degrees global warming. And the consensus of the scientific community is that there is a carbon budget, about a third of global fossil fuel reserves, that could be burned and restrict AGW to no more than 2 degrees. It's not absolute in the same way there is no absolute value for climate sensitivity. Science has determined a pathway we can take that requires major industrialised nations to reduce emissions to net zero by 2050. No pathway demands it happens in 5 years.
So what we can say, we can't say how big the ecological crisis will be, but what we can say is it's going to be a big bang type thing.
The rest of Roger's long and rambling talk goes into revolutionary politics and a political tipping point brought on by a climate crisis, and determines there is a need for radical revolutionary politics to take control, perhaps led by a charismatic leader. It is in the closing part that Roger's endgame is revealed, a prophetic transformation where people abandon the material world and shed the burden of hope and instead fight for the divine good.
But the real game changer is what I'm calling prophetic transformation. So what it means is you're not in the herd anymore, because the herd is humanity, or fallen humanity, as you might say, if you're going to be Old Testament about it. So you hear the voice of God, and God says, the truth's here, right? The truth is my truth, right? Which you might call physics. And so you have this big archetype in the human experience, which is everyone's going to hell, and then someone hears the voice of God and moves here and stays there and sometimes gets killed or whatever, or not, or what the case may be. And, you know, in the Hollywood script, everyone suddenly realizes this is where the truth is, and the whole herd slides this way. You see what I mean? Because everyone gets with the program, and there's a few sub-dynamics. So one of the dynamics is fearlessness. So fearlessness is like super attractive. It's a deep psychological human trait. So if someone comes along and says, I'm going over there and I'm fearless, everyone goes, well, yeah, maybe that's good. Because, you know, maybe it's a sort of semi-herding thing. But a more fundamental point here is that all the dynamics of herding are basically materialistic, if you see what I mean. They're basically saying, oh, you know, I'm going to lose money, so I'm going to stay here. Oh, I'm going to lose power, so I'm going to stay here. Oh, I'm going to lose friends, so I'm going to stay here, right? While the prophetic tradition is basically like spiritual, and it's outside, metaphysically, it's outside the material world. So what the practical outcome of this, of course, is virtue ethics. So the essential element of virtue ethics is you're not concerned about what happens. All you're concerned about is doing the right thing.
Roger's talk on the end game for Extinction Rebellion becomes a promotion for his new political party. The Beyond Politics Party has already set itself apart from Exile's civil disobedience activism by stealing food and giving it away, and attacking NGOs with flyers and paint. But how far will the idea they are doing the work of the ultimate truth take them is another matter. The extreme climate meltdown that Roger claims is the truth means that any action is justified, considering that extinction is the price of failure. Roger is not the first leader to pursue extreme activism to avert extreme consequences. The danger is such activism may alienate the middle ground who need to be on board with transition to a low-carbon future. But also, if adherents to Roger's new revolutionary politics are radicalised, then they may well be putting themselves and others in danger. Greenpeace ensures that their actions do not result in injury. Trying to climb an oil rig in Arctic waters requires a high degree of skill, planning and training.